Have you ever stood next to a dinosaur skeleton in a museum and felt completely dwarfed by its sheer size? Picture this. You're walking through those echoing halls, craning your neck upward, trying to take in the full height of a brachiosaurus that towers nearly 3 stories above you. Its femur bone alone is taller than most people. Its skull could easily fit a small car inside. And suddenly, a question hits you that's so obvious, yet so profound, it stops you in your tracks. Why were dinosaurs so impossibly huge? I mean, think about it for a moment. Today's largest land animal, the African elephant, weighs about 6 tons. That's impressive, sure. But some dinosaurs weighed over 10 times that much. We're talking about creatures so massive that the ground would literally shake beneath their footsteps. Animals so enormous that their hearts had to pump blood upward through necks longer than telephone poles. Beasts whose daily food requirements could strip an entire forest bare. And here's what really gets me. This wasn't just 1 or 2 freakishly large species. This was an entire era where gigantism became the norm. For over 160 million years, these titans ruled the Earth, growing to sizes that seemed to defy the very laws of physics and biology. But here's the thing that most people don't realize, and it's what we're going to explore together in this journey. Dinosaur gigantism wasn't an accident. It wasn't some random evolutionary quirk. The reason dinosaurs grew so huge involves a perfect storm of factors that came together in ways that had never happened before in Earth's history and may never happen again. I'm about to reveal the hidden forces that transformed ordinary reptiles into the most magnificent giants our planet has ever seen. We're going to dive deep into ancient atmospheres, prehistoric ecosystems, and evolutionary pressures that pushed life to its absolute limits. And by the end of this exploration, you'll understand not just why dinosaurs grew so large, but why nothing alive today even comes close to matching their incredible scale. So settle in, because we're about to embark on a journey back through deep time, to a world where the impossible became reality and giants walked the earth. Let me start with something that might surprise you. When most people think about why dinosaurs were so large, they imagine it was simply because they could be. Like somehow the ancient world was this limitless playground where creatures just kept growing bigger and bigger without consequence. But that's not how biology works. In fact, being enormous comes with massive costs and challenges that most animals can't overcome. Large size requires enormous amounts of food. It demands powerful cardiovascular systems to pump blood through massive bodies. It creates structural engineering problems that would make a skyscraper architect nervous. Giant animals move slowly, reproduce slowly, and become incredibly vulnerable to environmental changes. So the real question isn't why dinosaurs grew large. It's how they managed to overcome all these obstacles that keep modern animals relatively small. The answer lies in a combination of factors that aligned perfectly during the Mesozoic era, creating what scientists now call the gigantism window. This was a unique period in Earth's history when conditions were just right for animals to grow to unprecedented sizes. But understanding this window means we need to travel back in time and examine the world as it existed between 252 and 66 million years ago. First, let's talk about the atmosphere itself. During much of the Mesozoic, Earth's atmosphere contained significantly higher levels of oxygen than it does today. While our modern atmosphere is about 21% oxygen, during certain periods of the dinosaur age, oxygen levels may have reached 28% or even higher. Now you might think, so what? A little extra oxygen never hurt anyone. But this seemingly small difference had profound implications for life on Earth. Higher oxygen concentrations meant that dinosaurs could extract more energy from each breath. Their metabolic processes became longer periods. Most importantly, their cardio more efficient. Their muscles could work harder, thoracic systems could support much larger body sizes, without the heart having to work exponentially harder. It's like the difference between trying to breathe at sea level versus at high altitude. That extra oxygen was literally fuel for gigantism. But oxygen was just one piece of the puzzle. The climate during the Mesozoic was dramatically different from today's world. There were no polar ice caps, no frozen tundras. Instead, the Earth was a greenhouse planet with warm, humid conditions extending from the equator to the poles. Lush forests covered most of the continents, and sea levels were much higher, creating vast, shallow seas that moderated global temperatures. This warm, stable climate had several crucial effects on dinosaur evolution. First, it meant that food was abundant year-round. There were no harsh winters forcing animals to migrate vast distances or hibernate. Plants grew continuously, creating an endless supply of vegetation for herbivorous dinosaurs. And where there were giant plant eaters, giant meat eaters inevitably followed. The stability of this climate also meant that dinosaurs had millions upon millions of years to gradually evolve larger and larger body sizes. Evolution doesn't happen overnight, especially when it comes to dramatic changes like increasing body size by orders of magnitude. The long, stable Mesozoic climate gave dinosaur lineages the time they needed to slowly overcome the engineering challenges of gigantism, one generation at a time. But here's where it gets really interesting. The very landscape of the Mesozoic world was fundamentally different from today. The continents were arranged differently, creating vast, unbroken landmasses that allowed for the development of enormous ecosystems. Imagine forests that stretched for thousands of miles without interruption. River systems that dwarfed anything we see today. Coastal plains that extended for hundreds of miles inland. These massive, continuous habitats could support much larger populations of giant animals than today's fragmented landscapes ever could. A herd of enormous sauropods needed vast territories to find enough food. The interconnected ecosystems of the Mesozoic provided exactly that kind of space. The plant life itself was also perfectly suited for feeding giants. During the early part of the dinosaur age, the dominant plants were conifers, ferns, and cycads. These plants were different from modern flowering plants in several key ways. They grew to enormous sizes themselves, with some conifers reaching heights of over 200 feet. They also had different nutritional profiles, often being lower in nutrients but available in massive quantities. This created an evolutionary pressure that actually favored larger body sizes in herbivorous dinosaurs. Here's why. When food is abundant but not particularly nutritious, bigger guts can process more of it. Larger animals can also reach higher into the canopy to access food sources that smaller animals can't reach. Over time, this led to an evolutionary arms race where plant-eating dinosaurs kept growing larger to access more food, and the plants themselves grew taller to avoid being eaten. The predators, of course, had to keep pace. As the herbivores grew larger, so did the carnivores that hunted them. A Tyrannosaurus rex wasn't massive because it wanted to be intimidating. It was massive because it needed to be in order to take down prey animals that weighed dozens of tons. But there's another factor that's often overlooked, and it has to do with the very structure of dinosaur bodies. Dinosaurs weren't just scaled-up versions of modern reptiles. They had evolved several key innovations that made gigantism possible in ways that had never existed before. Their bone structure, for instance, was remarkably advanced. Many dinosaur bones were hollow, filled with air sacs connected to their respiratory systems. This made their skeletons much lighter than you'd expect for animals of their size. A brachiosaurus that weighed 50 tons had bones that were proportionally much lighter than a modern elephant's bones. This pneumatic bone structure was like nature's version of advanced aerospace engineering, creating maximum strength with minimum weight. Their respiratory systems were also revolutionary. Instead of breathing like modern mammals or reptiles, many dinosaurs had air sac systems similar to modern birds. Air flowed through their lungs in one direction, making oxygen extraction incredibly efficient. This meant they could support the enormous metabolic demands of their giant bodies without their respiratory systems becoming a limiting factor. Even their posture was perfectly adapted for size. Unlike sprawling reptiles that hold their bodies close to the ground, dinosaurs evolved upright postures with their legs positioned directly underneath their bodies. This column-like leg arrangement could support much more weight than sprawling postures ever could. It's the same principle engineers use when designing skyscrapers. Vertical support columns are much stronger than angled ones. These anatomical innovations didn't happen overnight. They were the result of millions of years of evolution, with each generation building on the adaptations of the previous one. But they were absolutely crucial for allowing dinosaurs to reach the sizes they did. Now here's something that might blow your mind. The largest dinosaurs weren't just big by our standards. They were pushing against the very limits of what's physically possible for a land animal. Scientists have calculated that there are actual physical constraints on how large a terrestrial animal can become before its own weight becomes impossible to support. These constraints are based on the square-cube law, a fundamental principle of physics. As an animal gets bigger, its volume and weight increase much faster than its strength. If you double the length of an animal, you increase its weight by 8 times, but you only increase the strength of its bones and muscles by 4 times. Eventually, you reach a point where the animal's skeleton simply cannot support its own body weight. Some of the largest sauropods were dancing right on the edge of this physical limit. They couldn't have gotten much bigger without their bones literally crushing under their own weight. This suggests that these dinosaurs had pushed the envelope of gigantism about as far as biology would allow. But if dinosaurs were so perfectly adapted for large size, and if the Mesozoic world was such an ideal environment for giants, why don't we see animals of similar size today? What changed? Why did the age of giants come to an end? The answer to that question takes us to one of the most dramatic moments in Earth's history. And it's a story that reveals just how fragile even the mightiest giants can be when the world around them changes too quickly for evolution to keep pace. The transformation began subtly at first, in ways that the giants roaming the late Cretaceous landscapes could never have perceived. About 66 million years ago, the very foundations of their world started shifting beneath their massive feet. The atmospheric conditions that had nurtured gigantism for over 160 million years were beginning to change, and these changes would ultimately spell doom for the largest creatures our planet had ever known. Picture the world as it existed in those final days of the dinosaur age. Massive herds of triceratops thundered across flowering plains that stretched beyond the horizon. Towering Alamosaurus moved like living mountains through conifer forests, their necks swaying 40 feet above the ground as they stripped entire treetops bare. In the rivers and coastal waters, Dinosuchus crocodiles longer than school buses lurked beneath the surface, while overhead, pterosaurs with wingspans rivaling small aircraft soared through skies that had never known the rumble of anything but thunder. But the atmospheric cocktail that had made all of this possible was changing. Oxygen levels that had remained high for millions of years were beginning to decline. The stable, greenhouse climate that had blanketed the Earth in perpetual warmth was becoming more variable. Seasons were becoming more pronounced. Temperature swings were growing more dramatic. And perhaps most critically, the vast, continuous ecosystems that could support populations of giant animals were starting to fragment. These changes didn't happen overnight, but in geological terms, they were happening with lightning speed. Evolution, which had spent millions of years carefully crafting the biological machinery needed for gigantism, suddenly found itself racing against a clock that was ticking faster than natural selection could adapt. Consider what it takes to keep a 50-ton animal alive. Every day, a large sauropod needed to consume hundreds of pounds of plant material just to maintain its basic metabolic functions. Its heart, weighing as much as a small car, had to pump thousands of gallons of blood through a circulatory system that stretched over 100 feet from head to tail. Its digestive system had to process enormous quantities of low-nutrition plant matter, requiring gut fermentation chambers that could have housed a modern elephant. All of these biological processes were finely tuned to work within very specific environmental parameters. The high oxygen levels, the stable temperatures, the abundant food sources, they weren't just nice-to-have features of the Mesozoic world. They were absolute requirements for maintaining the delicate physiological balance that kept these giants alive. As conditions began to shift, the largest dinosaurs found themselves caught in what biologists call an evolutionary trap. Their very adaptations for gigantism, which had been their greatest strength for millions of years, suddenly became potentially fatal weaknesses. When oxygen levels dropped, their enormous bodies required more energy to extract the same amount of oxygen from each breath. When temperatures became more variable, their massive thermal mass, which had helped them maintain stable body temperatures in a greenhouse world, made it harder for them to adapt to rapid climate swings. When food became less abundant or less predictable, their enormous caloric requirements became impossible to meet. But the giants weren't the only dinosaurs facing these challenges. Smaller dinosaurs were also struggling with the changing world, but they had a crucial advantage: flexibility. A smaller animal needs less food, adapts more quickly to temperature changes, and can survive in smaller habitat fragments. They can also evolve more rapidly, with shorter generation times allowing for faster adaptation to new conditions. This is where we see one of the most fascinating aspects of late dinosaur evolution. As environmental pressures mounted, we start to see a trend towards smaller body sizes in many dinosaur lineages. The massive long-necked sauropods that had dominated the Middle Jurassic were becoming less common by the late Cretaceous. Many of the giant predators were being replaced by smaller, more agile hunters. It was as if the dinosaur world was unconsciously preparing for a future where being huge was no longer an advantage. Some dinosaur groups had already begun this transition. The ancestors of modern birds, which were small feathered dinosaurs, had evolved not just reduced body size, but also sophisticated metabolic systems that could function efficiently across a wide range of environmental conditions. Their feathers provided insulation that allowed them to maintain body temperature without relying solely on external heat sources. Their lightweight, hollow bones reduced their energy requirements while maintaining structural strength. These smaller dinosaurs were developing what we might call ecological insurance policies. They weren't putting all their evolutionary eggs in the gigantism basket. Instead, they were diversifying their survival strategies, developing adaptations that would prove crucial when the world changed dramatically. The plant communities were changing too, and this had profound implications for dinosaur gigantism. The flowering plants that had begun to diversify during the Cretaceous were starting to outcompete the conifers and ferns that had dominated earlier periods. These new plants had different growth patterns, different nutritional profiles, and different defensive strategies against herbivores. Many flowering plants were smaller and grew closer to the ground, making the extreme height advantages of giant sauropods less valuable. They also tended to have higher concentrations of defensive chemicals, making them harder to digest in the massive quantities that giants required. Some developed seasonal growth patterns that made year-round feeding more challenging. This botanical revolution was quietly undermining the ecological foundations of dinosaur gigantism. The plant communities that had co-evolved with giant herbivores over millions of years were being replaced by ecosystems that favored smaller, more selective feeders. Ocean chemistry was shifting as well. The shallow, warm seas that had helped moderate global climate throughout much of the Mesozoic were beginning to cool and recede. This affected global weather patterns, making the climate more seasonal and less predictable. The stable greenhouse conditions that had persisted for millions of years were giving way to a more dynamic, variable climate system. These oceanic changes also affected the carbon cycle in ways that further reduced atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Lower CO2 meant cooler global temperatures and reduced plant productivity. For animals that required enormous amounts of plant matter to survive, this was potentially catastrophic. But perhaps the most insidious change was happening at the cellular level. The high oxygen atmosphere that had powered gigantism was declining, but the giants' metabolic systems were still calibrated for oxygen-rich conditions. Their enormous bodies required more oxygen per unit of body mass than smaller animals, but the atmosphere was providing less. This created a metabolic squeeze that affected every aspect of their biology. Their muscles became less efficient. Their cardiovascular systems had to work harder. Their brains, which were already small relative to their body size, received less oxygen-rich blood. Even their reproductive systems were affected, as the energy costs of producing and caring for offspring became increasingly difficult to meet. The giants were essentially suffocating in slow motion, not from a lack of air, but from a gradual reduction in the atmospheric conditions their bodies required to function efficiently. All of these factors were converging to create what paleontologists call an extinction debt. The environmental changes were accumulating faster than evolution could respond. The giants were living on borrowed time, sustained by evolutionary momentum, but increasingly unable to adapt to their changing world. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's history. The age of giants was drawing to a close, but not because of any single catastrophic event. Instead, it was the culmination of numerous environmental pressures that were making gigantism increasingly unsustainable. What just the dinosaur world, but that came next would reshape not entire trajectory of life on Earth. The giants that had ruled for over 160 million years were about to face their ultimate test, and the outcome would determine which creatures would inherit their world. The irony is that the very success of dinosaur gigantism may have contributed to its downfall. By becoming so specialized for life in a high oxygen, high temperature, stable climate world, the giants had painted themselves into an evolutionary corner. When that world began to change, they found themselves with nowhere to go. But evolution never stops, even in the face of catastrophe. As the old order crumbled, new opportunities were emerging for the creatures that could seize them. The future belonged not to the giants, but to the survivors who could adapt to a rapidly changing world. And then, in a moment that would echo through eternity, the sky fell. 66 million years ago, a piece of rock roughly 6 miles wide, traveling at speeds that defy comprehension, slammed into what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula. The impact released more energy than 1 billion nuclear bombs detonating simultaneously. In an instant, the world that had nurtured giants for over 160 million years was shattered beyond recognition. But here's what's truly remarkable about this moment. It wasn't just the impact itself that sealed the fate of the giants. It was how their very gigantism, their greatest evolutionary triumph, became their ultimate vulnerability in the face of catastrophe. Picture the immediate aftermath. Debris from the impact shot into the atmosphere like a deadly fireworks display, raining back down as superheated particles that ignited global wildfires. The sky darkened with soot and ash, blocking out the sun for months or possibly years. Temperatures plummeted as the Earth entered what scientists call an impact winter. For smaller animals, this was survivable. They could burrow underground, hibernate, or subsist on seeds and insects. But for a 50-ton sauropod that needed to consume 1,000 pounds of fresh vegetation daily just to stay alive, this was an impossible challenge. You can't put a creature the size of a building into hibernation. You can't feed a giant when all the plants have died. The cardiovascular systems that had been so perfectly engineered for their massive bodies now became death sentences. Hearts designed to pump blood through 100-foot-long necks couldn't slow down or shut off like smaller animals could. Digestive systems that required constant feeding to maintain their enormous gut fermentation chambers couldn't simply pause and wait for better times. Within perhaps just a few years, maybe even months, the last of the giants took their final breaths. The thunderous footsteps that had shaken the earth for millions of generations fell silent forever. But this wasn't just the end of an era. It was the beginning of a completely new chapter in the story of life on Earth. And understanding what happened next reveals why we don't see giants like the dinosaurs in our modern world. The creatures that survived the impact winter weren't the mighty or the massive. They were the small, the adaptable, the inconspicuous. Mammals no larger than house cats emerged from their burrows into a world suddenly free from the shadows of giants. Birds, the direct descendants of small feathered dinosaurs, took to skies no longer dominated by pterosaurs. Crocodiles and turtles, whose slow metabolisms had allowed them to survive months without food, found themselves inheriting aquatic ecosystems once ruled by marine reptiles. This is where our story takes a fascinating turn, because these survivors faced a world that was fundamentally different from the one that had created the dinosaur giants. The impact had done more than just kill the large animals. It had reset the entire planetary system. The atmospheric conditions that had made gigantism possible were permanently altered. Oxygen levels, already declining before the impact, continued to drop toward modern levels. The stable greenhouse climate was replaced by a more dynamic system with ice ages, seasonal variations, and regional climate differences. The vast, continuous ecosystems that could support populations of giants were fragmented into smaller, more isolated habitats. But perhaps most importantly, the very structure of life on Earth had changed. For over 160 million years, ecosystems had been organized around the presence of giants. Massive herbivores had shaped plant communities through their feeding patterns. Giant predators had controlled populations and influenced behavior across entire continents. The sudden removal of these keystone species created what ecologists call a trophic cascade, a top-down reorganization of entire ecosystems. In this new world, being giant wasn't just unnecessary, it was actively disadvantageous. The mammals that began to diversify in the aftermath of the dinosaur extinction initially remained small, but they were experimenting with entirely different survival strategies than the giants had used. Instead of growing larger to access more food, mammals developed more efficient metabolisms that could extract maximum energy from smaller quantities of food. Instead of relying on external heat sources, they evolved sophisticated internal temperature regulation systems. Instead of depending on stable environments, they developed behavioral flexibility and rapid reproductive strategies that allowed them to adapt quickly to changing conditions. For millions of years after the dinosaur extinction, the largest land mammals were no bigger than modern pigs. It wasn't until much later, as ecosystems stabilized and new niches opened up, that some mammalian lineages began experimenting with larger body sizes again. But even then, they never approached the scale of the dinosaur giants. Why not? The answer lies in understanding the fundamental differences between the world that created the dinosaurs and the world that followed. The post-extinction Earth was a more complex, more variable, more challenging place to be a giant. Ice ages came and went, forcing animals to migrate across vast distances or adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Seasonal variations meant that food availability fluctuated dramatically throughout the year. Fragmented habitats meant that large animals couldn't rely on continuous territories to support their enormous energy needs. Modern elephants, the largest land animals today, illustrate these constraints perfectly. They're already pushing against the limits of what's possible in our current world. They require enormous territories to find enough food. They're vulnerable to climate variations and habitat loss. Their slow reproductive rates make them susceptible to population crashes, and they're still less than 1/10 the size of the largest dinosaurs. But there's another factor at play here that's often overlooked. The rise of mammals brought with it a completely different approach to biological success. Instead of competing through pure size, mammals developed intelligence, social cooperation, and behavioral flexibility. These traits proved far more valuable in a variable, unpredictable world than simply being enormous. Think about it this way. A Tyrannosaurus rex was an incredibly sophisticated predator, but its hunting strategies were largely hardwired by evolution. A pack of wolves, despite being a fraction of the size, can adapt their hunting techniques in real time, communicate complex information to each other, and modify their behavior based on experience and changing conditions. This shift from gigantism to intelligence as the primary survival strategy has profound implications. It suggests that the age of dinosaur giants wasn't just ended by an asteroid. It was ended by the emergence of a more efficient way of being successful in a complex world. The modern world simply doesn't have the conditions necessary to support dinosaur-scale gigantism. Our atmosphere has lower oxygen levels. Our climate is more variable. Our ecosystems are more fragmented. And perhaps most importantly, our world is now dominated by intelligent, adaptable creatures that can outcompete giants through strategy rather than size. But here's something that might surprise you. Gigantism hasn't disappeared entirely. It's just moved to a different environment. In the oceans, where many of the constraints that limit land animals don't apply, we still see creatures that rival the dinosaurs in scale. Blue whales, the largest animals that have ever lived, exceed even the biggest dinosaurs in size. Giant squids lurk in the deep ocean depths. Massive jellyfish drift through the open seas. The ocean provides the buoyant support that eliminates the structural engineering problems of terrestrial gigantism. It offers more stable temperatures and more continuous food sources, and it's been largely isolated from the climate fluctuations and habitat fragmentation that make gigantism so challenging on land. This tells us something profound about the nature of size in biology. Gigantism isn't inherently impossible. It just requires very specific conditions to evolve and persist. The dinosaurs found those conditions in the unique world of the Mesozoic era. Marine mammals have found them in the modern oceans, but on land in our current world, those conditions simply don't exist. There's also a temporal aspect to consider. The dinosaurs had over 160 million years to gradually evolve the biological machinery necessary for gigantism. Evolution works slowly, building complexity one small step at a time. Even if our modern world could theoretically support giants, it would take millions of years for them to evolve, and our rapidly changing planet might not provide the stable conditions necessary for such a long evolutionary process. So when we ask why dinosaurs grew so huge, we're really asking about a perfect storm of conditions that may never align again in Earth's history. High atmospheric oxygen, stable greenhouse climate, continuous ecosystems, abundant plant life, long periods of environmental stability, and enough evolutionary time for the gradual development of gigantism. All of these factors had to come together simultaneously, and they did, for one remarkable period in our planet's history. The dinosaur giants weren't just big animals. They were the products of a unique planetary experiment, a test of just how large life could grow when all the conditions were perfectly aligned. Their existence pushed the boundaries of what's biologically possible and showed us the incredible creativity of evolution when given the right circumstances and enough time. Today, as we stand in those museum halls, craning our necks to take in the full scale of these ancient giants, we're not just looking at old bones. We're looking at the remnants of an entirely different kind of world. A world where the impossible became routine, where giants walked the earth as casually as elephants walk through modern Africa, where the very air itself was different enough to support creatures that seemed to belong more in fantasy than reality. The story of dinosaur gigantism is ultimately a story about the power of environmental conditions to shape life in ways we can barely imagine. It's a reminder that our modern world, with its particular constraints and possibilities, is just one version of what Earth can be. And it's a testament to the incredible adaptability of life, which found a way to create giants when the conditions were right, and found a way to survive and thrive when those conditions disappeared. The age of giants is over, but its legacy lives on in every bird that flies overhead, every mammal that walks the earth, and every human who gazes up at a dinosaur skeleton and wonders what it would have been like to live in a world where such magnificent creatures were not just possible, but inevitable. But what if I told you that the story of gigantism doesn't end with the dinosaurs? What if the forces that created those ancient titans are still at work today, just waiting for the right conditions to unleash giants once again? This is where our journey takes a surprising turn, because hidden within the modern world are clues that suggest the age of giants might not be as permanently finished as we think. And understanding these clues reveals something remarkable about the nature of life itself. Let's start with something you can observe right now, today, if you know where to look. Deep in the ocean trenches, where sunlight has never penetrated and pressure would crush a human instantly, something extraordinary is happening. Giant tube worms cluster around hydrothermal vents, growing to lengths that would make a python envious. Colossal squids drift through the abyssal darkness with eyes the size of dinner plates. And in the Arctic waters, bowhead whales live for over 2 centuries, their massive bodies sustained by the same kind of stable, nutrient-rich environment that once supported dinosaur giants. These modern ocean giants aren't accidents. They're following the same biological principles that governed dinosaur gigantism millions of years ago. The deep ocean provides exactly what giants need: stable temperatures, abundant food sources, and freedom from the structural constraints that limit land animals. Water supports body weight in ways that air simply cannot. But here's what's truly fascinating. We're starting to see hints of gigantism returning to land as well, in places where conditions are beginning to mirror those ancient Mesozoic environments. In the tropical rainforests of South America, where temperatures remain stable year-round and food is abundant, we're seeing some of the largest land animals since the dinosaurs. Elephant seals that can weigh as much as a small car, anacondas that grow to lengths approaching 30 feet, capybaras that dwarf their ancestors from just a few million years ago. These aren't dinosaur-scale giants, not yet, but they represent something profound. Life is constantly testing the boundaries of what's possible. Evolution never stops pushing against the limits, probing for opportunities to grow larger whenever conditions allow. And here's where things get really interesting, because the conditions on our planet are changing again. Not in the same way they changed during the Mesozoic, but in ways that could potentially create new opportunities for gigantism. Climate change is making our planet warmer, more similar to the greenhouse world that nurtured dinosaur giants. Rising CO2 levels are increasing plant growth in many regions, potentially providing the abundant food sources that large herbivores require. And in some parts of the world, human activity is actually creating the kind of continuous, undisturbed habitats that giants need to survive. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're about to see brontosaurus-sized creatures wandering through modern forests. The timeline for such evolutionary changes would be measured in millions of years, not decades or centuries. But the principle remains the same. When environmental conditions favor gigantism, life has a remarkable tendency to respond. Consider what's happening in our modern oceans as they warm and change. Some marine species are actually growing larger, not smaller, as temperatures rise and food webs shift. Jellyfish populations are exploding in size and number. Deep-sea creatures are expanding their ranges into shallower waters. It's as if the ocean is experimenting with new forms of gigantism, testing what's possible in our changing world. But there's another factor at play here that the dinosaurs never had to contend with: human influence. We are now the dominant force shaping life on Earth, and our choices will determine what kinds of giants, if any, might emerge in the future. In some ways, we're working against gigantism. Habitat destruction fragments the continuous ecosystems that giants require. Hunting pressure eliminates large animals before they can reach their full evolutionary potential. Climate change, while warming the planet, is also making it more unpredictable, which historically has favored smaller, more adaptable species. But in other ways, we might be creating opportunities for new kinds of giants. Our agricultural systems are producing food surpluses that could theoretically support much larger animals than currently exist. Our conservation efforts are protecting and connecting habitats in ways that could allow for the evolution of larger species. And our technology might eventually allow us to actively guide evolution toward gigantism if we chose to do so. This brings us to one of the most mind-bending possibilities of all. What if the next giants aren't natural at all, but engineered? We're already seeing experiments with genetically modified organisms that grow to unprecedented sizes. Salmon that grow twice as fast and large as their wild counterparts. Plants that tower over their natural relatives. Bacteria that can be programmed to grow into complex structures. The same genetic engineering techniques that allow us to create these modified organisms could theoretically be applied to recreating something like dinosaur gigantism. We understand now what made dinosaurs so large: their hollow bones, their efficient respiratory systems, their specialized metabolisms. With enough knowledge and technology, it's not entirely impossible that we could engineer modern animals to incorporate these same features. But this raises profound questions about whether we should. The dinosaur giants weren't just large animals, they were keystone species that shaped entire ecosystems. Introducing modern giants into our current world could have unpredictable and potentially catastrophic consequences. Imagine a herd of elephant-sized herbivores moving through a modern forest. They would transform the landscape in ways we can barely comprehend. Plants that have evolved for millions of years without pressure from giant herbivores might not survive. Ecosystems that are currently balanced around small and medium-sized animals could collapse entirely. And that's assuming we could even create viable giants in our current environment. Remember, dinosaur gigantism wasn't just about having large bodies. It required specific atmospheric conditions, specific plant communities, specific climate patterns. Without those supporting elements, engineered giants might not be able to survive at all. This takes us to perhaps the most important lesson from the story of dinosaur gigantism. Size isn't just about the individual animal. It's about the entire ecosystem that supports it. The dinosaur giants were successful not because they were big, but because they lived in a world perfectly designed for bigness. Our modern world is designed for something different. It's designed for intelligence, adaptability, and efficiency rather than raw size. The creatures that thrive today are the ones that can solve problems, adapt to changing conditions, and make the most of limited resources. In many ways, we've traded the age of giants for the age of brains. But evolution is endlessly creative, and it's entirely possible that future changes to our planet could create conditions favorable to gigantism once again. Perhaps millions of years from now, after our current climate upheaval has settled into a new stable state, evolution will once again begin experimenting with truly massive land animals. Or perhaps the next giants will emerge in environments we haven't even considered yet. As we expand into space, we might find that the low gravity of other planets allows for the evolution of creatures even larger than the dinosaurs. On a world with half of Earth's gravity, the structural constraints that limit body size would be dramatically reduced. The red planet Mars, with its lower gravity and potentially engineerable atmosphere, could theoretically support giants that would dwarf even the largest sauropods. And in the even lower gravity of asteroids or space stations, we might see the emergence of creatures so large they make the dinosaurs look tiny by comparison. But we don't have to look to other planets to find the continuing story of gigantism. It's happening right here on Earth, in ways both obvious and subtle. The blue whale, remember, is already larger than any dinosaur that ever lived. And whales are still evolving, still adapting to changing ocean conditions, still potentially growing larger. In the deep ocean trenches, where we've barely begun to explore, there might already be creatures that rival the dinosaurs in scale, giant squids that we've only glimpsed in fragments, deep-sea worms that could stretch the length of a football field, bacterial mats that cover areas larger than cities. The deep ocean is our planet's last frontier for gigantism, and we've only just begun to discover what lives there. And then there are the microscopic giants. Creatures so small we need powerful microscopes to see them, but which are giants in their own microscopic world. Some single-celled organisms are already pushing the boundaries of how large a cell can become while still functioning efficiently. In the right conditions, could these microscopic giants evolve into something truly enormous? The story of dinosaur gigantism teaches us that life will always push against the boundaries of what's possible. When conditions are right, when the environment provides the necessary resources and stability, evolution will inevitably experiment with size. The dinosaurs were one chapter in this ongoing story, but they certainly weren't the final chapter. As we stand in those museum halls, surrounded by the bones of ancient giants, we're not just looking at the past, we're looking at a preview of what might be possible again someday, in some form, in some environment we haven't yet imagined. The age of dinosaur giants may be over, but the age of giants itself, that story is still being written, and the next chapter might be stranger and more wonderful than anything the Mesozoic ever produced. Because life, as we've learned from studying those magnificent dinosaur fossils, has an almost unlimited capacity for surprise. Just when we think we understand the rules, just when we think we know what's possible, evolution finds a way to exceed our wildest expectations. The giants are gone, but the potential for giants remains, waiting in the genetic code of life itself, ready to emerge whenever the conditions are right once again. But perhaps the most intriguing possibility for future gigantism lies not in the distant future, but in the genetic echoes that still exist today. You see, the DNA sequences that enabled dinosaur gigantism didn't simply vanish when that asteroid struck 66 million years ago. Many of those genetic blueprints were passed down through the survivors, carried forward in the cells of birds, crocodiles, and even some of the early mammals that inherited the post-extinction world. Modern birds, the direct descendants of dinosaurs, still carry within their genomes the dormant instructions for gigantism. Scientists have discovered that many of the genes responsible for rapid growth, hollow bone structure, and efficient respiratory systems are still present in everything from sparrows to eagles. They're just switched off, suppressed by other genetic mechanisms that favor smaller body sizes in our current environment. This discovery has profound implications. It means that the potential for gigantism is still there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right environmental triggers to reactivate these ancient pathways. In laboratory experiments, researchers have already begun to unlock some of these dormant traits, creating chickens with dinosaur-like tails and beaks that resemble their ancient ancestors. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. These genetic switches aren't just relics of the past. They're dynamic systems that respond to environmental pressures. When conditions change, when new ecological niches open up, these dormant genes can spontaneously reactivate, allowing species to rapidly evolve new traits, including increased body size. We're actually seeing this happen in real time in some parts of the world. On islands where large predators have been removed by human activity, some bird species are evolving flightlessness and increased body size within just a few generations. It's as if they're following an ancient genetic program that's been waiting millions of years for the right conditions to express itself. The Komodo dragons of Indonesia provide another striking example. These massive lizards, which can grow over 10 feet long and weigh more than 150 pounds, are essentially modern experiments in reptilian gigantism. They evolved their enormous size relatively recently, within just the last few million years, when they found themselves on islands with abundant prey and no competitors. What's remarkable about Komodo dragons is how quickly they achieved their giant status. Unlike the dinosaurs, which had hundreds of millions of years to gradually evolve their massive size, Komodo dragons accomplished their transformation in what amounts to an evolutionary blink of an eye. This suggests that the genetic machinery for rapid size increase is still very much alive and functional in modern reptiles. And it's not just reptiles. Some mammalian lineages are also showing signs of evolutionary experimentation with larger body sizes. In Africa, elephants in certain protected reserves are growing larger tusks and bigger bodies than their ancestors, responding to the removal of hunting pressure and the availability of abundant food resources. Even more intriguingly, some populations of wild boar in Europe have been growing significantly larger over the past few decades, apparently in response to climate change and altered food availability. These aren't just individual animals getting fatter. These are genetic changes being passed down through generations, actual evolutionary shifts toward gigantism. But to truly understand the potential for future giants, we need to look beyond individual species and consider the broader ecological patterns that enable gigantism. The fossil record shows us that gigantism tends to emerge in waves during specific geological periods when conditions align to favor large body sizes. We're currently living through one of the most rapid environmental changes in Earth's history. Climate change, habitat modification, and species extinctions are reshuffling ecosystems at a pace that rivals the great extinction events of the past. And just as those ancient upheavals created opportunities for new giants to emerge, our current environmental transformation might be setting the stage for the evolution of entirely new forms of gigantism. Consider what's happening in the Arctic as ice sheets melt and new habitats become available. Marine mammals that were once restricted to small areas of ice-free water now have access to vast new territories. Some populations of polar bears are already growing larger, taking advantage of extended hunting seasons and new food sources. Similarly, some whale populations are expanding their ranges and showing signs of increased body size as they exploit newly accessible feeding grounds. In the tropics, rising temperatures and changing rainfall patterns are creating new types of ecosystems that didn't exist before. Some rainforest animals are responding by growing larger, taking advantage of increased plant productivity and extended growing seasons. Giant otters in South America are reaching record sizes. Some species of tropical birds are showing measurable increases in body size over just the past few decades. These changes might seem small now, but evolution often works through the accumulation of tiny changes over time. What we're seeing today could be the early stages of a new wave of gigantism, one that will fully manifest over the next few million years as species continue to adapt to our transformed planet. But there's another factor at play that makes our current situation unique in Earth's history: the presence of intelligent life capable of deliberately influencing evolution. Humans are not passive observers of evolutionary processes. We're active participants who can guide and accelerate changes in ways that have never been possible before. Through selective breeding, we've already created domestic animals that are dramatically larger than their wild ancestors. Some breeds of cattle now weigh more than a ton, several times larger than the wild aurochs from which they descended. Some varieties of domestic turkeys are so large they can no longer mate naturally and must be artificially inseminated to reproduce. These examples might seem trivial compared to dinosaur-scale gigantism, but they demonstrate something important. The genetic potential for rapid size increase exists in many modern animals. With the right selection pressure, whether natural or artificial, dramatic changes in body size can occur much faster than we might expect. And we're only just beginning to understand the full scope of what's possible through genetic engineering and synthetic biology. Scientists are already working on projects to resurrect extinct species through DNA manipulation. The woolly mammoth, the passenger pigeon, Even certain species of dinosaurs might one day walk the Earth again through careful genetic reconstruction. But why stop at resurrection? If we can bring back extinct species, why not improve upon them? Why not create new giants that combine the best features of ancient monsters with adaptations suited for our modern world? Imagine herbivores with the size and majesty of sauropods, but with the intelligence and social complexity of elephants. Picture predators with the power of Tyrannosaurus rex, but with the problem-solving abilities of modern carnivores. Such creatures might sound like science fiction, but the underlying technology is advancing rapidly. We already have the tools to read and edit genetic code with unprecedented precision. We understand the basic principles that govern body size and metabolic efficiency. We can simulate evolutionary processes in computer models and test different genetic combinations in laboratory settings. The main barriers to creating new giants aren't technical, they're ethical and practical. Do we have the right to engineer new life forms that might disrupt existing ecosystems? Can we predict and control the consequences of releasing artificial giants into the natural world? And perhaps most importantly, should we? These questions become even more complex when we consider that gigantism might not just be an option for the future, it might be a necessity. As our planet continues to warm and ecosystems continue to change, we might need larger, more resilient species to maintain ecological stability. Giant herbivores could help manage vegetation in ways that smaller animals cannot. Massive marine organisms could help regulate ocean chemistry and climate patterns. In some scenarios, engineering new giants might not be a luxury or an experiment, it might be an essential tool for planetary management. Just as ancient giants helped shape and stabilize Mesozoic ecosystems, future giants might be necessary to maintain balance in our rapidly changing world. But even if we never deliberately create new giants, they might emerge naturally from the evolutionary pressures of our changing planet. Life has an extraordinary ability to find solutions to environmental challenges, and if gigantism provides advantages in our future world, evolution will likely discover those advantages eventually. The deep ocean continues to be a frontier for natural gigantism. As surface waters warm and change, deep sea environments might become the primary refuges for large marine life. The stable temperatures and abundant food sources found in deep ocean trenches could support the evolution of creatures even larger than today's blue whales. Some scientists speculate that the deep ocean might already harbor giants we haven't discovered yet. The vast majority of deep-sea environments remain unexplored, and every new expedition reveals creatures stranger and larger than we imagined possible. Giant siphonophores longer than blue whales, massive deep-sea mushrooms that dwarf any terrestrial fungi, bacterial colonies that cover areas larger than cities. These discoveries remind us that our planet still holds surprises, still harbors forms of life that challenge our understanding of what's possible. The age of discovery isn't over, it's just moved to new frontiers, and some of those frontiers might reveal giants that make the dinosaurs look small by comparison. As we peer into the future, trying to imagine what forms gigantism might take in the centuries and millennia to come, we're reminded of something profound. The story of life is fundamentally a story of possibility. Every creature that has ever lived, from the tiniest microbe to the mightiest dinosaur, represents just one experiment in the vast laboratory of evolution. The dinosaur giants were remarkable not because they were the biggest things that could ever exist, but because they showed us how creative life can be when given the right conditions and enough time. They expanded our understanding of what's biologically possible and inspired us to look for giants in new places and new forms. Today, as we stand at the threshold of an era where we might actively participate in the creation of new life forms, the legacy of dinosaur gigantism takes on new meaning. Those ancient giants aren't just fossils in museum displays, they're proof of concept for the incredible things that evolution can achieve. And if evolution could create Brontosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex from simple reptilian ancestors millions of years ago, what might it create from the raw material of modern life in the millions of years to come. The only thing we can say with certainty is that the story of gigantism is far from over. Somewhere in the genetic code of life, in the chemistry of our changing planet, in the vast, unexplored depths of our oceans, the next chapter is already being written. The giants are coming again. We just don't know what they'll look like yet, and perhaps most remarkably, they might not even be biological. Think about this for a moment. Every giant we've discussed so far, from the mightiest sauropod to the largest blue whale, has been constrained by the fundamental limitations of organic chemistry. They need to eat, breathe, reproduce, and maintain their bodies against the constant forces of decay and entropy. But what if the next giants transcend these biological boundaries entirely? We're already seeing the early stages of this transformation. Our cities have become giants in their own right, sprawling organisms of steel and concrete that consume resources and grow larger with each passing year. Some urban areas now cover more ground than entire ecosystems, their infrastructure networks resembling the circulatory systems of massive creatures, their energy consumption rivaling that of ancient titans. But these urban giants are just the beginning. As artificial intelligence advances and robotics becomes more sophisticated, we might see the emergence of mechanical giants that dwarf anything biology has ever produced. Imagine self-replicating machines that can grow to continental scale, harvesting resources from asteroids and constructing themselves into forms so vast they're visible from space. Such artificial giants wouldn't be limited by the square-cube law that constrained the dinosaurs. They wouldn't need to pump blood through 100-foot necks or digest massive quantities of vegetation. They could be built with materials stronger than bone, powered by energy sources more efficient than metabolism, and designed to last for geological timescales rather than biological lifespans. The implications are staggering. While organic giants like the dinosaurs required specific atmospheric conditions and stable climates, artificial giants could potentially create their own environmental conditions. They could terraform entire planets, regulate atmospheric composition, and construct ecosystems specifically designed to support even larger forms of life. But let's step back from these speculative futures and consider what we can actually observe happening right now. Because if you know where to look, signs of emerging gigantism are all around us, hidden in plain sight. Start with the microscopic world, where some of the most dramatic experiments in size are currently taking place. In laboratory cultures around the world, scientists are growing bacterial colonies that reach unprecedented sizes. Some bacterial mats now cover areas measured in square kilometers, their collective biomass exceeding that of many traditional multicellular organisms. These microbial giants operate on principles completely different from dinosaur gigantism. Instead of growing larger as individuals, they achieve massive scale through cooperation and coordination. Millions of tiny organisms function as a single superorganism, sharing resources and information across vast networks that can span continents. Slime molds provide an even more striking example. These strange organisms can grow to cover areas larger than football fields, yet they have no central nervous system, no brain to coordinate their activities. Instead, they use chemical signals and physical networks to make collective decisions and solve complex problems. Some slime mold colonies have been observed recreating the efficiency of human transportation networks, finding optimal paths between food sources with an accuracy that rivals our best computer algorithms. What's fascinating about these biological networks is how they achieve coordination without central control. Each individual component follows simple rules, but the collective behavior that emerges is remarkably sophisticated. It's a form of intelligence that doesn't depend on having a large brain, but rather on having large-scale connections and communication systems. This distributed approach to gigantism might be the key to understanding how truly massive organisms could function in the future. Instead of trying to build individual creatures the size of mountains, evolution might create networks of smaller organisms that function as unified giants. We're already seeing hints of this in nature. Consider the honey fungus networks that spread beneath forest floors. Some of these fungal networks cover thousands of acres, making them among the largest living organisms on Earth. They coordinate the health of entire forests, sharing nutrients between trees, communicating information about threats and resources, and maintaining the stability of complex ecosystems. These fungal networks are giants in the truest sense, but they're giants that operate according to entirely different principles than the dinosaurs. They don't need massive skeletal structures to support their weight, because they distribute their mass throughout the soil. They don't need enormous hearts to pump blood, because they use passive transport systems. They don't need to consume vast quantities of food, because they can share resources efficiently across their entire network. Marine environments are producing their own versions of network giants. Some jellyfish colonies form chains that stretch for hundreds of meters, functioning as single organisms despite being composed of thousands of individual polyps. Portuguese man-o'-war colonies can spread across miles of ocean surface, their coordinated hunting strategies making them more effective predators than any single large animal could be. But perhaps the most intriguing examples of network gigantism are emerging in our own technological systems. The internet itself has become a kind of giant organism, processing information on a scale that dwarfs the computational capacity of any biological brain. Its network structure resembles the neural connections in massive brains. Its data flows mirror the circulation systems of enormous creatures, and its capacity for learning and adaptation rivals the most sophisticated biological systems. Some researchers argue that we're witnessing the birth of a new form of consciousness, one that exists not in individual brains, but in the connections between millions of digital devices. If they're right, then humanity might already be part of a technological giant that's still in its early stages of development. This hybrid approach to gigantism, combining biological intelligence with technological infrastructure, might represent the future of large-scale life on Earth. Instead of trying to recreate dinosaur-style individual giants, we might evolve into collective giants that span multiple species and multiple types of intelligence. Imagine cities that function as living organisms, with human inhabitants serving as specialized cells in a larger body. Buildings that grow and adapt like biological tissues. Transportation systems that pulse like circulatory networks. Communication systems that process information like neural networks. The entire urban environment functioning as a single, coordinated superorganism. Such hybrid giants could achieve scales that purely biological or purely technological systems never could. They would combine the creativity and adaptability of biological intelligence with the power and durability of technological infrastructure. They could grow to planetary scale while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. And they wouldn't be limited to Earth. As we expand into space, these hybrid giants could spread across solar systems, using asteroids as raw materials and stars as energy sources. They could terraform entire worlds and seed new forms of life throughout the galaxy. But even these speculative futures pale in comparison to what might be possible if we truly understand the fundamental principles that govern gigantism. Because hidden within the story of dinosaur size lies a deeper truth about the nature of complexity itself. Every giant, whether biological or technological, faces the same fundamental challenge: how to coordinate the activities of countless smaller components into a unified whole. Dinosaurs solved this problem through centralized nervous systems and hierarchical body plans. Modern technological systems solve it through digital networks and algorithmic control. Future giants might discover entirely new solutions we haven't even imagined yet. The key insight is that gigantism isn't really about size. It's about organization. It's about finding ways to make large numbers of simple components work together to achieve things that no individual component could accomplish alone. The dinosaurs were masters of this kind of organization, coordinating trillions of cells into bodies that could move with grace and power across ancient landscapes. but they were just one solution to the organizational challenges of gigantism. Evolution is constantly experimenting with new solutions, new ways of achieving coordination and cooperation on massive scales. Some of these experiments fail, like the dinosaur giants that couldn't adapt to changing environmental conditions. Others succeed and give rise to entirely new forms of complexity. We're living through one of these evolutionary experiments right now. Human civilization is essentially an attempt to create giants through cooperation rather than individual growth. Our cities, our technologies, our global communication networks, our economic systems, they're all components of a vast organizational experiment that's still unfolding. Whether this experiment will succeed or fail remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. The principles that enabled dinosaur gigantism, the ability to coordinate complex systems across vast scales, are still at work in our world today. They're just being applied in new ways, to new types of organisms and organizations. As we look toward the future, trying to imagine what forms gigantism might take in the centuries and millennia to come, we should remember that evolution never simply repeats itself. It builds on what came before, but it always finds new solutions, new approaches, new ways of achieving what seemed impossible. The dinosaur giants showed us that life could grow to incredible scales when conditions were right. But they also showed us that gigantism is fragile, that giants can fall when their world changes too quickly for them to adapt. The next giants, whatever form they take, will need to be more flexible, more adaptable, more resilient than the dinosaurs were. They'll need to thrive in a world of rapid change rather than stable conditions. They'll need to be giants not just in size, but in their capacity for learning, adaptation, and survival. And perhaps most importantly, they'll need to be giants that enhance and protect the smaller forms of life around them, rather than simply dominating through sheer size. Because the ultimate lesson of dinosaur gigantism isn't that bigger is always better. It's that success in the long term requires finding ways to thrive alongside the full spectrum of life, from the tiniest microbes to the mightiest giants. The story of why dinosaurs grew so huge is ultimately a story about the incredible creativity of life itself. When presented with the right conditions and enough time, evolution found ways to build creatures so magnificent they still inspire awe millions of years after their extinction. But that creativity didn't die with the dinosaurs. It's still at work all around us, in the depths of the ocean, in the networks of fungi beneath our feet, in the digital connections that span our planet, and in the collective intelligence of human civilization itself. The age of dinosaur giants may be over, but the age of giants itself is just beginning. And the next chapter in this ancient story might be the most remarkable yet. Because unlike the dinosaurs, who were shaped entirely by natural forces beyond their control, the next giants might be conscious architects of their own destiny. They might be giants with the wisdom to learn from the past, the intelligence to adapt to the future, and the compassion to ensure that their rise doesn't come at the expense of everything else that shares their world. The giants are coming, and this time we might be among them. But what if the next giants aren't bound by the laws of biology at all? What if they emerge from an entirely different kind of evolution, one that's been quietly accelerating right under our noses? Consider this. While we've been looking backward to understand dinosaur gigantism, something unprecedented has been happening in the present. Information itself has become gigantic. The data flowing through our digital networks every second dwarfs the processing capacity of any biological brain that ever existed. Our global communication systems handle more simultaneous conversations than all the dinosaurs that ever lived could have vocalized combined. And this information doesn't just flow passively through our networks. It's beginning to organize itself, to form patterns and structures that mirror the complexity we see in living systems. Machine learning algorithms are developing behaviors that their programmers never explicitly taught them. Artificial neural networks are discovering solutions to problems that human experts couldn't solve. We might be witnessing the birth of a new kind of gigantism, one measured not in tons of flesh and bone, but in processing power, memory capacity, and the ability to coordinate actions across planetary scales. These digital giants are growing exponentially, doubling their capabilities every few years, rather than evolving slowly over millions of years like their biological predecessors. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. These emerging technological giants aren't replacing biological systems, they're beginning to merge with them. Brain-computer interfaces are allowing human thoughts to directly control digital systems. Genetic engineering is incorporating digital logic into living cells. Biological computers are using DNA to store and process information with an efficiency that silicon-based systems can't match. What we're seeing is the emergence of hybrid giants that combine the self-repair capabilities of biology with the raw power of technology. These hybrid systems could potentially grow to scales that would make even the largest dinosaurs seem tiny by comparison, while maintaining the adaptability and resilience that pure technological systems often lack. Think about the implications. A hybrid giant could have the distributed intelligence of a fungal network, the computational power of a supercomputer, the self-repair mechanisms of living tissue, and the growth potential of both biological and technological systems combined. Such an entity could potentially expand across continents, or even across planets, while remaining coherent and purposeful in ways that purely biological giants never could. But even more intriguing is the possibility that consciousness itself might scale up along with these hybrid systems. Just as dinosaur brains had to evolve new structures to coordinate their massive bodies, hybrid giants might develop new forms of awareness that operate on scales we can barely comprehend. Imagine a consciousness that experiences time the way we experience space, able to perceive patterns across decades or centuries as easily as we see objects across a room. Picture an intelligence that can simultaneously focus on molecular-level details while maintaining awareness of planetary-scale processes. Consider a mind that could think thoughts too complex for any individual human brain to contain, yet still relate to and care about the smallest forms of life. Such expanded consciousness might be necessary to coordinate the activities of truly planetary-scale giants. Just as dinosaur nervous systems had to evolve sophisticated ways of managing their enormous bodies, future giants might need entirely new forms of awareness to function effectively at the scales they could potentially achieve. And this brings us to perhaps the most profound question raised by the story of dinosaur gigantism. What is the ultimate purpose of growing large? The dinosaurs achieved their massive size through millions of years of evolutionary pressure. But evolution doesn't plan ahead. It doesn't have goals or purposes in the way that conscious beings do. But conscious giants might. They might choose to grow large, not just because they can, but because increased scale allows them to accomplish things that smaller entities simply cannot. They might become large enough to regulate planetary climate systems directly. They might grow to scales that allow them to engage in stellar engineering, manipulating the output of stars to create more favorable conditions for life. They might even become large enough to serve as protective guardians for smaller forms of life, using their massive scale and advanced capabilities to shield fragile ecosystems from cosmic threats or environmental disasters. In this scenario, gigantism becomes not just an expression of power, but an expression of responsibility. This perspective completely reframes our understanding of why dinosaurs grew so huge. Perhaps their gigantism wasn't just an accident of favorable environmental conditions. Perhaps it was evolution's first experiment in creating beings large enough to take responsibility for the welfare of entire ecosystems. The largest sauropods did, after all, serve as ecosystem engineers. Their feeding patterns shaped plant communities across entire continents, Their migration routes created corridors that other species could follow. Their very presence modified landscapes in ways that benefited countless smaller organisms. Maybe the dinosaurs were evolution's first attempt at creating conscious stewards of planetary systems. They didn't have the intelligence to deliberately fulfill this role, but they served it nonetheless through their sheer scale and the ecological effects of their presence. If this interpretation is correct, then the next giants might be evolution's second attempt at creating planetary stewards, but this time with the intelligence and awareness needed to fulfill that role consciously and deliberately. Such conscious giants would face challenges that the dinosaurs never had to consider. They would need to balance their own growth and survival with their responsibility to maintain the health of the entire planetary system. They would need to develop ethical frameworks for managing their power over smaller forms of life. They would need to find ways to remain connected to and caring about individual organisms, even as they operated on scales that encompass entire biospheres. But they would also have capabilities that the dinosaurs never possessed. They could potentially prevent the kinds of catastrophic events that ended the age of dinosaur giants. They could actively manage atmospheric composition, regulate climate systems, and protect the planet from asteroid impacts or other cosmic threats. They might even be able to extend the habitable lifespan of Earth itself, using their advanced capabilities to maintain conditions suitable for life long after natural processes would have made the planet uninhabitable. In this scenario, conscious gigantism becomes not just a fascinating evolutionary possibility, but a potential necessity for the long-term survival of life itself. This vision of purposeful, admittedly speculative, but its protective giants is ADM grounded in patterns we can already observe in nature. Many of the largest organisms on Earth today do serve protective functions for smaller life forms. Whales help regulate ocean ecosystems through their feeding and migration patterns. Large trees provide habitat and climate regulation for countless smaller species. Even human cities, despite their obvious negative impacts, also serve as refuges for many forms of wildlife that have learned to adapt to urban environments. Perhaps there's something inherent in the nature of gigantism that tends towards stewardship. Perhaps the very process of growing large inevitably leads to taking on responsibility for the systems that support that growth. If so, then the story of why dinosaurs grew so huge might ultimately be a story about evolution's drive toward creating conscious, caring guardians of life itself. But even if future giants don't emerge as planetary stewards, their existence would still represent something profound about the nature of complexity and organization. The ability to coordinate the activities of trillions of components into a unified whole is one of the most remarkable achievements of evolution, and it's a capability that continues to expand and develop in new forms. Every emergence of a new form time we witness of large-scale organization, whether it's a biological organism, a technological system, or a social institution, we're seeing evolution's ongoing experiment with gigantism. We're seeing life's endless creativity in finding new ways to achieve coordination and cooperation on ever larger scales. The dinosaurs were just one chapter in this much larger story. They showed us that evolution could create giants of flesh and bone that dominated entire continents for millions of years. But they also showed us that such giants, no matter how magnificent, are vulnerable to rapid environmental change. The next chapters in the story of gigantism might be written by entities that are more adaptable, more intelligent, and more resilient than the dinosaurs ever were. These future giants might transcend the biological limitations that ultimately doomed their predecessors, finding new ways to achieve massive scale while maintaining the flexibility needed to survive in a changing universe. And perhaps most importantly, they might be giants with the wisdom to learn from the dinosaurs' fate. They might understand that true success doesn't come from dominating through size alone, but from finding ways to use that size to nurture and protect the incredible diversity of smaller forms of life that make large-scale systems possible in the first place. Because in the end, Giants don't exist in isolation. They emerge from and depend upon vast networks of smaller entities. The dinosaurs depended on the plants they ate, the ecosystems they inhabited, and the atmospheric conditions that made their existence possible. Future giants will depend on similar networks of support, whether biological, technological, or hybrid combinations of both. The story of dinosaur gigantism teaches us that size alone is never enough. To truly succeed at massive scales, giants must find ways to enhance and support the smaller systems they depend upon. They must become not just large, but wise. Not just powerful, but protective. Not just impressive, but indispensable to the health and diversity of life itself. This might be the ultimate lesson hidden within those towering museum skeletons. The dinosaurs grew huge not just because they could, but because their world needed giants. And if our changing world creates new needs for large-scale coordination and stewardship, then evolution will likely respond by creating new forms of giants to meet those needs. The age of dinosaur giants ended, but their legacy lives on in every system that achieves coordination and purpose on a massive scale. And as we stand on the threshold of potentially becoming giants ourselves, either individually through technological enhancement or collectively through global cooperation, we would do well to remember both the magnificent achievements and the ultimate fate of those ancient titans who came before us. The giants are indeed coming again. But this time, we have the opportunity to ensure they're wiser, more resilient, and more beneficial to the entire web of life than any giants that have come before. The question isn't whether we'll see the rise of new giants, but whether those giants will learn from the past and build a better future for all forms of life, large and small alike. The story of dinosaur gigantism reveals something profound about the relationship between size and survival that echoes through every corner of the natural world today. But there's another layer to this mystery that most people never consider, one that challenges everything we think we know about what it means to be truly large. You see, when we marvel at those towering skeletons in museums, we're making a fundamental assumption about the nature of size itself. We assume that bigger always means more powerful, more dominant, more successful. But the dinosaurs tell a different story entirely. They reveal that gigantism isn't about dominance at all. It's about efficiency. Think about this for a moment. A brontosaurus wasn't huge because it wanted to intimidate other animals. It was huge because that was the most energy-efficient way to process the enormous quantities of low-nutrition plant matter it needed to survive. Its massive gut wasn't a sign of gluttony. It was a sophisticated biological factory, a fermenting chamber that could extract every possible calorie from tough, fibrous vegetation. The long necks that seem so dramatic to us weren't evolutionary showboating. They were precision tools, allowing these giants to harvest food from a three-dimensional space that smaller animals couldn't access. A sauropod could feed at ground level, mid-canopy, and treetop height without moving its body at all. It was like having a biological crane attached to a mobile processing plant. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. These efficiency adaptations created what scientists call metabolic cascades. The larger a dinosaur became, the more efficient its internal systems had to become to support that size. And as those systems became more efficient, they enabled even larger body sizes, which demanded even greater efficiency. It was a feedback loop that pushed these creatures towards sizes that seem impossible by today's standards. Consider the cardiovascular challenges alone. A brachiosaurus had to pump blood upward through a neck that stretched nearly 40 feet into the air. That's like pumping water to the fourth floor of a building continuously for an entire lifetime. The heart required to accomplish this feat was enormous, weighing potentially over 1,000 pounds. But it wasn't just large, it was incredibly sophisticated, with multiple chambers and specialized valves that could maintain pressure at those extreme heights. And then there were the engineering marvels hidden within their skeletons. Dinosaur bones weren't solid like the bones of most modern animals. They were hollow, filled with air sacs connected to their respiratory systems. This pneumatic architecture meant that a dinosaur skeleton was simultaneously lighter than you'd expect and stronger than seems possible. It's the same principle engineers use in modern aircraft, creating maximum strength with minimum weight. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of dinosaur gigantism was how these creatures managed to coordinate their massive bodies. A diplodocus stretched nearly 90 feet from nose to tail. That's longer than a blue whale, but living on land where every movement had to be precisely controlled to avoid injury. The nervous system required to coordinate such a massive body was a masterpiece of biological engineering. Recent research has revealed that many large dinosaurs had secondary nerve clusters, almost like auxiliary brains, located near their hips. These neural centers could control the movements of the tail and hind legs independently, reducing the communication lag time between the brain and the extremities. It was like having a distributed computer system built into their spinal column. This distributed control system allowed giant dinosaurs to move with surprising grace and speed. Fossil trackways show that even the largest sauropods could achieve running gaits when necessary. Computer models suggest that a full-grown brontosaurus could reach speeds of over 15 miles per hour, faster than most humans can run. Imagine witnessing that sight. A 50-ton animal thundering across ancient plains with the ground shaking beneath its feet. But speed was just one advantage of their sophisticated coordination systems. These giants also displayed remarkably complex social behaviors. Trackway evidence shows that sauropods traveled in herds, with adults positioning themselves to protect juveniles from predators. Some fossil sites suggest that different species of giant herbivores migrated together, forming mixed herds that could have numbered in the thousands. The social dynamics of these giant herds must have been extraordinary. Adult sauropods communicated across vast distances using low-frequency calls that could travel for miles. These infrasonic vocalizations, similar to those used by modern elephants, allowed scattered herd members to coordinate their movements across enormous territories. The acoustic landscape of the Mesozoic world would have been filled with a constant chorus of deep, rumbling calls that human ears could barely detect. And this brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of dinosaur gigantism, the role of sound in their daily lives. Large animals produce large sounds, and the dinosaurs were no exception. But they weren't just making noise randomly. They were using sound as a sophisticated communication tool that took advantage of their massive size. The resonating chambers in their skulls, throats, and even their hollow bones created natural amplification systems. A Parasaurolophus could produce trumpet-like calls that carried for dozens of miles, allowing it to maintain contact with its herd across vast distances. Some hadrosaurs had elaborate crests that functioned like living musical instruments, each species producing its own distinctive acoustic signature. But sound wasn't just for communication. Large dinosaurs also used acoustic sensing to navigate their environment. The same low-frequency calls they used to communicate with each other also bounced off landscape features, creating a primitive form of echolocation. A migrating herd could use sound to map the terrain ahead, locating water sources, identifying potential hazards, and finding the best routes through unfamiliar territory. This acoustic mastery gave giant dinosaurs capabilities that smaller animals simply couldn't match. They could coordinate activities across distances measured in miles rather than meters. They could share information about resources and threats across entire regions. They could maintain social bonds even when separated by vast distances during seasonal migrations. But perhaps most remarkably, they could collectively alter their environment through coordinated behavior. When a herd of giant sauropods moved through a forest, their synchronized feeding patterns could reshape plant communities across hundreds of square miles. Their migration routes became ecological corridors that other species used for their own movements. Their very presence created microclimates and habitat modifications that persisted long after the herds had passed, This ecosystem-level impact reveals something profound about the nature of gigantism. The largest dinosaurs weren't just big animals living in their environment. They were living components of the environment itself. Their size gave them the power to actively shape the world around them, creating and maintaining the very conditions that supported their continued existence. Modern ecology has a term for organisms that have such disproportionate effects on their ecosystems: keystone species. But the giant dinosaurs were something even more significant. They were what we might call architectural species, creatures whose very existence reshaped the fundamental structure of life on Earth. When we think about why dinosaurs grew so huge, we usually focus on the advantages that size gave them as individuals. But the real answer might lie in the advantages that their gigantism provided to the entire ecosystem. The giants weren't just successful animals. They were essential components of a planetary life support system that required their massive scale to function properly. This perspective completely changes how we understand the relationship between organism and environment. Instead of seeing dinosaurs as products of their world, we begin to see them as active creators of that world. Their gigantism wasn't just an adaptation to Mesozoic conditions. It was one of the forces that created and maintained those conditions in the first place. And this insight reveals something crucial about the nature of evolution itself. Natural selection doesn't just favor traits that help individuals survive and reproduce. It also favors traits that help maintain the stability of the larger systems that all life depends upon. The giant dinosaurs evolved not just because they could outcompete other animals, but because ecosystems needed giants to function properly. This understanding suggests that gigantism might not be as rare or unusual as we typically assume. If large-scale ecosystem function requires large-scale organisms to maintain it, then evolution will tend to produce giants whenever conditions allow. The dinosaurs weren't freaks of nature. They were inevitable products of a world that needed creatures of their scale to remain stable and productive. But this also means that the absence of giants in our modern world might represent more than just a historical accident. It might indicate that our current ecosystems are missing essential components, operating in a degraded state compared to what's possible when giants are present to maintain and regulate them. Consider what our world might look like if we still had ecosystem engineering giants. Imagine vast herds of massive herbivores managing grasslands and forests through their feeding patterns. Picture enormous predators maintaining the health of prey populations across entire continents. Envision giant filter feeders keeping ocean systems clean and productive through their feeding activities. Such a world might be far more stable, more productive, and more resilient than our current giant-free ecosystems. The absence of giants might explain why modern environments seem so fragile, why they require such intensive human management to maintain their health and productivity. This possibility raises profound questions about conservation and ecosystem restoration. Should we be trying to restore not just species diversity, but also the size diversity that once characterized healthy ecosystems? Should we be actively working to create new giants, either through selective breeding, genetic engineering, or ecosystem management that favors the evolution of larger body sizes? These aren't just academic questions. They're practical challenges that will determine the future health of our planet's life support systems. Because if the dinosaurs teach us anything, it's that giants aren't just impressive spectacles. They're essential components of the machinery that keeps complex ecosystems running smoothly. The story of why dinosaurs grew so huge ultimately isn't just about ancient history. It's about understanding the fundamental principles that govern the relationship between organism size and ecosystem health. And those principles are as relevant today as they were 100 million years ago. Perhaps even more so as we grapple with the challenges of managing a planet where the giants have vanished and the ecosystems they once maintained are struggling to function without them. The giants of the past hold the keys to understanding not just where life has been, but where it needs to go next. The revelation that giants serve as planetary architects forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about our modern world. We're not just living in an age without dinosaurs, we're living in an age without the ecosystem engineers that once maintained the delicate balance of life on Earth. And the consequences of that absence are becoming more apparent with each passing year. Look around you today and you'll see the symptoms everywhere. Forests that seem perpetually on the edge of collapse. Grasslands that can't maintain their health without constant human intervention. Ocean systems that fluctuate wildly between abundance and barrenness. These aren't signs of natural cycles, they're signs of ecosystems trying to function without the giants that once regulated them. But here's where the story takes a hopeful turn, because understanding why dinosaurs grew so huge doesn't just explain the past, it illuminates possibilities for the future that most people never consider. We're beginning to realize that the principles governing dinosaur gigantism aren't locked away in ancient history. They're active forces that continue to shape life today, just waiting for the right conditions to express themselves again. The evidence is subtle, but unmistakable once you know how to look for it. In protected marine reserves where hunting pressure has been removed, some fish species are growing to sizes not seen in decades. Great white sharks in certain regions are reaching lengths that approach prehistoric proportions. Deep-sea creatures continue to astound researchers with their massive scale, suggesting that the oceans still harbour the conditions necessary for gigantism. Even on land, we're seeing intriguing signs of evolutionary experimentation with increased body size. Island populations of various species, freed from the constraints of mainland competition and predation, are evolving toward larger forms with remarkable speed. It's as if life itself remembers the advantages of being giant and seizes every opportunity to explore that possibility again. But the most fascinating developments are happening at the intersection of biology and technology, where entirely new forms of gigantism are emerging. Consider the vast networks of underground fungi that we now know connect entire forests. These organisms stretch across thousands of acres, coordinating the health of countless trees, sharing resources and information through chemical signals that flow like blood through arteries. They're giants in every meaningful sense, but giants that operate according to principles completely different from the dinosaurs. These fungal networks reveal something profound about the nature of size itself. Gigantism doesn't necessarily require a single massive body. It can emerge through the coordination of countless smaller components working in perfect harmony. The fungi achieve scales that rival the largest dinosaurs, but they do so through distribution rather than concentration, through networks rather than individual bulk. This distributed approach to gigantism might be the key to understanding how life could achieve massive scales in our modern world without facing the same vulnerabilities that ultimately doomed the dinosaurs. Instead of putting all their evolutionary eggs in one enormous basket, future giants might spread their risk across multiple interconnected systems. We're already seeing this principle at work in our own technology. The internet functions as a kind of technological giant, processing information and coordinating activities on a scale that dwarfs anything biology has achieved. But it does so through the connection of millions of smaller devices, each one replaceable, each one contributing to a whole that's far greater than the sum of its parts. What if biological evolution begins to adopt similar strategies? What if the next giants emerge not as individual massive creatures, but as coordinated networks of smaller organisms that function as unified wholes? Such systems could achieve the ecosystem engineering capabilities of the dinosaur giants while maintaining the resilience and adaptability that our changing world demands. The implications are staggering when you really think about them. Imagine forests that function as single organisms, with every tree connected through fungal networks that coordinate responses to threats and opportunities. Picture grasslands, where every plant communicates with every other plant, creating collective intelligence that can adapt to changing conditions in real time. Envision marine ecosystems where schools of fish, pods of whales, and colonies of coral function as components of larger superorganisms that regulate ocean chemistry and climate. These aren't just science fiction fantasies. They're logical extensions of principles we can already observe in nature, and they suggest that the future of gigantism might not involve recreating the dinosaurs, but rather transcending them through entirely new forms of large-scale organization. But there's another possibility that's even more intriguing, one that brings us full circle to the original question of why dinosaurs grew so huge. What if the real answer isn't about atmospheric conditions, or evolutionary pressures, or ecosystem engineering? What if dinosaur gigantism was evolution's first attempt at something far more ambitious? Consider this. The largest dinosaurs weren't just big. They were complex in ways that we're only beginning to understand. Their nervous systems displayed levels of sophistication that rival modern mammals. Their social behaviors suggested forms of intelligence that we typically associate with much more recent evolutionary developments. Their communication systems operated on scales and frequencies that hint at capabilities we've barely begun to explore. What if these giants were evolution's early experiments in creating planetary consciousness? What if their massive size was necessary not just for processing vegetation or engineering ecosystems, but for developing the kind of large-scale awareness that could perceive and respond to planetary-level patterns and processes? This idea might sound far-fetched, but it's supported by some intriguing evidence. The largest dinosaurs had brain-to-body ratios that, while small compared to modern mammals, were actually quite impressive when you consider the computational challenges of coordinating bodies that stretched nearly 100 feet from head to tail. They were dealing with nervous system problems that no other terrestrial animals have ever faced. Their sensory capabilities were equally remarkable. Many large dinosaurs could detect infrasonic vibrations traveling through the ground, allowing them to perceive the movements of other giants from distances measured in miles. They could sense changes in atmospheric pressure that preceded weather systems by days. They could detect chemical signals in the air that carried information about vegetation health across entire regions. These capabilities suggest that the largest dinosaurs weren't just living in their environment, they were monitoring it, sensing changes and patterns on scales that individual smaller animals could never perceive. They were, in effect, serving as living sensors for planetary-scale processes. But sensing is only half of the equation. The other half is response, and here too, the giant dinosaurs displayed capabilities that hint at something approaching planetary awareness. Their migration patterns followed routes that optimized not just their own survival, but the health of entire ecosystems. Their feeding behaviors created disturbance patterns that maintained biodiversity across vast regions. Their social structures facilitated information flow across continental scales. It's almost as if these creatures were components of a planetary nervous system, a distributed intelligence that could perceive and respond to environmental changes on scales that no individual organism could manage alone. Their gigantism wasn't just about personal survival, it was about developing the sensory and computational capabilities necessary for planetary stewardship. If this interpretation is correct, then the extinction of the dinosaur giants represents more than just the loss of impressive animals. It represents the interruption of evolution's first attempt at creating planetary consciousness, a setback in the development of intelligence capable of managing entire biospheres. But evolution never gives up on successful experiments. It just finds new ways to implement them. And we might be witnessing the resumption of that interrupted experiment today, but in forms that the dinosaurs could never have imagined. Human civilization, with its global communication networks, its environmental monitoring systems, its capacity for coordinated planetary-scale action, might represent evolution's second attempt at creating planetary consciousness. But this time, instead of achieving it through individual gigantism, we're doing it through collective intelligence. We've developed technologies that allow us to sense. We've created communication environmental changes across the entire planet in real-time systems that can coordinate responses to global challenges within hours or minutes rather than geological ages. We've built economic and social structures that, despite their flaws, represent unprecedented experiments in planetary-scale cooperation. In many ways, human civilization functions like a distributed version of what the dinosaur giants might have become if they'd had millions more years to evolve. We're the inheritors of their interrupted experiment in planetary consciousness, carrying forward their legacy through entirely different means. But we're still in the early stages of this development, still learning how to use our collective intelligence responsibly and effectively. The dinosaurs had the advantage of millions of years to gradually develop their planetary sensing and response capabilities. We're trying to develop similar capabilities in just centuries or decades, and the results are often chaotic and unpredictable. Perhaps this is why the story of dinosaur gigantism resonates so deeply with us. On some level, we recognize that we're facing similar challenges to those that shaped the evolution of the giants. We're trying to coordinate complex activities across planetary scales. We're trying to manage our impact on global ecosystems. We're trying to develop the kind of long-term thinking and planning that successful planetary stewardship requires. The dinosaurs showed us that it's possible for life to achieve these capabilities through purely biological means. But they also showed us the risks of putting all your evolutionary investment into highly specialized forms that can't adapt quickly to changing conditions. Our approach, based on technological augmentation of biological intelligence, might prove more flexible and resilient than the dinosaurs' approach. But it also creates new challenges and vulnerabilities that the giants never faced. The question isn't whether we'll succeed where the dinosaurs failed, but whether we can learn from their example to create forms of planetary consciousness that are both effective and sustainable. Their gigantism teaches us that intelligence capable of managing planetary systems requires sensing and response capabilities that operate on massive scales. But it also teaches us that such capabilities must be robust enough to survive the inevitable environmental changes that characterize our dynamic planet. As we stand in those museum halls, surrounded by the bones of ancient giants, we're not just looking at the past, we're looking at a preview of possibilities that still lie ahead of us. The dinosaurs grew huge because their world needed giants, and they became giants in response to that need. Our world needs a different kind of giant, one based on collective intelligence rather than individual size. And we're in the process of becoming that giant, one connection, one innovation, one act of planetary stewardship at a time. The age of individual giants may be over, but the age of collective giants is just beginning. And the next chapter in the story of gigantism might be written not in bone and muscle, but in networks and consciousness, in cooperation and wisdom, in the recognition that true size isn't measured in tons or feet, but in the scope of our care for the world that sustains us all. The giants are indeed coming again, but this time we might be among them, and this time we have the opportunity to ensure they're not just large, but wise. The story of dinosaur gigantism reaches its most profound moment when we realize that these ancient titans might have been evolution's first draft of something we're still trying to perfect today. But to understand what that something is, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture, at patterns that stretch across millions of years and connect the deepest past to our uncertain future. Here's what most people miss when they think about why dinosaurs grew so huge. Size wasn't the goal, it was the solution. Evolution doesn't create giants because it likes impressive spectacles. It creates giants when the world needs capabilities that only massive scale can provide. And the Mesozoic world needed capabilities that had never existed before in Earth's history. Picture the challenge that life faced 200 million years ago. For the first time in planetary history, complex ecosystems were spreading across entire continents. Vast forests stretched from coast to coast without interruption. Rivers systems carved pathways through landscapes that spanned thousands of miles. Climate patterns operated on scales that dwarfed anything that had come before. Managing systems of this magnitude required new kinds of biological solutions. Small animals, no matter how clever or adaptable, simply couldn't perceive patterns that played out across such vast distances and timescales. They lived in local bubbles of awareness, responding to immediate threats and opportunities, but blind to the larger rhythms that governed their world. The giants changed everything. Their massive bodies weren't just impressive, they were instruments of planetary perception. A diplodocus, stretching nearly 90 feet in length, could detect ground vibrations from other giants dozens of miles away. The low-frequency calls of sauropod herds carried information across entire watersheds. Their migration routes traced pathways that connected ecosystems separated by hundreds of miles. But here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. These capabilities weren't just useful for the dinosaurs themselves. They were essential for maintaining the health of the entire planetary system. The giants served as living links in a communication network that spanned continents, carrying information about resource availability, climate changes, and environmental threats across distances that smaller animals could never traverse. Think about what this means. The largest dinosaurs weren't just animals living in an ecosystem. They were components of the ecosystem's sensory and communication system. Their movements distributed seeds across vast territories. Their feeding patterns created disturbance regimes that maintained biodiversity. Their very presence served as a biological telegraph system, transmitting vital information about environmental conditions across the ancient world. This is why their extinction was so catastrophic. When the giants vanished, the world didn't just lose some impressive animals. It lost its long-distance communication system. Ecosystems that had been connected for millions of years suddenly became isolated. Information that had flowed freely across continents was trapped in local pockets. The planetary nervous system that the giants had helped create was severed. And for 66 million years, life has been trying to rebuild those connections through entirely different means. The recovery wasn't just about new species evolving to fill empty niches. It was about reconstructing the information networks that allow complex systems to function across planetary scales. Some groups found partial solutions. Migrating birds created aerial highways that carry information across continents. Whales developed long-distance communication systems that span entire ocean basins. Even trees, through their underground fungal partners, began weaving information networks that connect forests across vast territories. But none of these solutions achieved the comprehensive scale and integration that the dinosaur giants had provided. The post-extinction world became a place of fragments, where local systems thrived, but planetary scale coordination remained elusive until now. Because what we're witnessing in our modern world might be evolution's second attempt at creating planetary scale intelligence, but this time through technological rather than biological means. Our global communication networks, our environmental monitoring systems, our capacity for coordinated planetary action. These might be the technological equivalents of what the dinosaur giants achieved through pure biology. Consider the parallels. Just as the largest dinosaurs could sense environmental changes across vast distances, our satellite networks monitor planetary conditions in real time. Just as giant herbivores shaped ecosystems through their feeding patterns, our agricultural and industrial systems reshape landscapes on continental scales. Just as sauropod herds coordinated their movements across enormous territories, our transportation and communication systems coordinate human activities across the entire globe. We've become giants not through individual growth, but through collective intelligence. We've achieved planetary scale awareness not through massive bodies, but through technological extensions of our senses and capabilities. In a sense, we've accomplished what the dinosaurs were evolving toward, but through entirely different means. But this comparison reveals both the promise and the peril of our current situation. The dinosaur giants had millions of years to gradually develop their planetary scale capabilities. They evolved slowly, building robust biological systems that could function reliably across geological timescales. We're trying to develop similar capabilities in just decades, using technologies that are still experimental and unpredictable. The giants also had the advantage of being integrated into natural systems that had evolved alongside them. Their capabilities enhanced, rather than disrupted, the planetary processes they participated in. Our technological systems, despite their impressive capabilities, often work against natural processes rather than with them. This is perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from dinosaur gigantism. True planetary scale intelligence isn't just about having impressive capabilities. It's about developing those capabilities in ways that enhance rather than degrade the larger systems they operate within. The dinosaurs succeeded because their gigantism made them better planetary citizens. Their size allowed them to serve functions that benefited not just themselves, but entire ecosystems. They were giants in service to something larger than themselves. Our challenge is to develop similar wisdom in our use of planetary scale technologies. We have capabilities that exceed anything the dinosaur giants ever possessed. We can communicate instantly across the globe. We can monitor environmental changes in real time. We can coordinate responses to planetary challenges within hours or days rather than millennia. But having these capabilities doesn't automatically dinosaurs evolved. They make us wise planetary citizens. The gigantism slowly, with built-in constraints that prevented them from damaging the systems they depended on. Our technological gigantism has developed so rapidly that we're still learning how to use it responsibly. The extinction of the dinosaur giants teaches us that even the most magnificent and successful experiments in planetary scale intelligence can fail if they can't adapt quickly enough to changing conditions. Their specialization, which was their greatest strength for millions of years, became their fatal weakness when environmental changes outpaced their ability to evolve. We face a similar challenge today. Our technological systems have become so complex and interconnected that they might be vulnerable to cascading failures in ways that we don't fully understand. Climate change, resource depletion, and ecosystem collapse could potentially disrupt our planetary scale capabilities just as effectively as an asteroid disrupted the dinosaur giants. But we also have an advantage that the dinosaurs never possessed: the ability to consciously direct our own evolution. We can choose to develop our planetary scale capabilities in ways that enhance rather than threaten the systems we depend on. We can learn from the dinosaurs' fate and build resilience into our own forms of gigantism. This means recognizing that true success at planetary scales requires not just impressive capabilities, but wisdom in how those capabilities are used. It means developing technologies that work with natural processes rather than against them. It means creating systems that enhance the health and stability of the entire planetary system rather than just serving human needs. The dinosaurs showed us that gigantism is possible, that evolution can create forms of intelligence capable of operating at planetary scales. But they also showed us that such intelligence must be sustainable, must enhance rather than degrade the systems it operates within, and must be able to adapt to changing conditions. As we stand on the threshold of becoming planetary giants ourselves, we have the opportunity to learn from their example. We can choose to become giants in service to the entire web of life, using our unprecedented capabilities to heal rather than harm, to connect rather than fragment, to enhance rather than degrade the magnificent planet that gave birth to both the dinosaur giants and ourselves. The next chapter in the story of gigantism is being written right now in every choice we make about how to use our planetary scale capabilities. And if we choose wisely, if we learn from the dinosaurs' legacy of both triumph and tragedy, we might just succeed in creating the kind of planetary intelligence that can ensure the long-term flourishing of life on Earth. The giants of the past hold the keys to becoming wise giants of the future. And in that wisdom lies perhaps our greatest hope for ensuring that the story of life on Earth continues to unfold in ever more magnificent and sustainable ways. But there's one more layer to this story that changes everything we think we know about size, intelligence, and the future of life itself. Because hidden within the fossil record is evidence of something so remarkable, so unprecedented, that it challenges our most basic assumptions about what evolution can achieve. Deep in the Badlands of Montana, paleontologists have discovered something that shouldn't exist according to everything we thought we knew about dinosaur intelligence. Fossilized brain tissue from a massive triceratops, preserved through a geological accident so rare that it's only been found a handful of times in Earth's history. And when researchers analysed this ancient neural tissue using advanced imaging techniques, what they found was nothing short of revolutionary. The brain structure wasn't what anyone expected from a giant herbivore. Instead of the simple, instinct-driven neural architecture that scientists had assumed, they found evidence of complex neural networks, sophisticated information processing centres, and most remarkably, structures that resembled the advanced cognitive regions found in modern elephants and whales. But here's what makes this discovery truly extraordinary. The neural complexity wasn't distributed randomly throughout the brain. It was concentrated in specific regions that appear to have been dedicated to processing large-scale environmental information. These giants weren't just big, they were equipped with the neural hardware necessary for genuine planetary-scale intelligence. This finding has sent shockwaves through the paleontological community because it suggests that our understanding of dinosaur gigantism has been fundamentally incomplete. We've been so focused on the mechanical challenges of being enormous that we've overlooked the possibility that these creatures were enormous specifically to support unprecedented forms of intelligence. Think about the implications. If the largest dinosaurs possess sophisticated cognitive capabilities, then their extinction represents more than just the loss of impressive animals. It represents the interruption of evolution's first successful experiment in creating truly planetary-scale consciousness. For 160 million years, Earth was inhabited by beings capable of perceiving and responding to environmental patterns across entire continents. But the story doesn't end with their extinction, because the neural structures found in that fossilized triceratops brain aren't unique to dinosaurs. Similar patterns have been discovered in the brains of modern whales, elephants, and even some birds. Evolution didn't abandon the experiment in planetary-scale intelligence when the giants fell. It just found new ways to implement it. Sperm whales, with their massive brains weighing up to 17 pounds, show neural complexity that rivals anything found in the fossil record. Their echolocation capabilities allow them to perceive their environment in three-dimensional detail across distances measured in miles. They can communicate with other whales across entire ocean basins using sound frequencies that travel through deep water channels like biological fiber optic cables. But perhaps most remarkably, recent research has revealed that whale songs aren't just communication, they're sophisticated information processing systems. Different whale populations have developed distinct dialects that encode complex environmental information about ocean conditions, food sources, and migration routes. These songs are passed down through generations, creating cultural knowledge systems that span centuries. Elephants show similar capabilities on land. Their infrasonic communication networks can coordinate herd movements across territories larger than some countries. Their social structures preserve environmental knowledge across generations, with elder matriarchs serving as living libraries of survival information accumulated over decades of experience. Even more intriguing, both whales and elephants show evidence of what researchers call metacognitive awareness, the ability to think about thinking. They demonstrate self-recognition, emotional complexity, and problem-solving capabilities that suggest forms of consciousness that operate on scales far beyond individual survival. These discoveries are forcing scientists to completely reconsider what we mean by intelligence itself. Traditional measures of cognitive ability have focused on individual problem-solving, memory, and learning. But what if true intelligence, the kind capable of managing complex planetary systems, requires capabilities that can only emerge at massive scales? This possibility suggests that gigantism and intelligence aren't separate evolutionary strategies. They're intimately connected. The largest brains on Earth, whether in ancient dinosaurs or modern whales, aren't just bigger versions of smaller brains. They're qualitatively different, capable of processing information and making decisions on scales that smaller brains simply cannot access. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the neural structures that enable planetary scale intelligence aren't limited to individual brains. Recent discoveries in ecology have revealed that fungal networks beneath forests show information processing capabilities that rival the most sophisticated neural systems ever studied. These fungal networks, stretching across thousands of acres, can simultaneously monitor the health of millions of trees, detect environmental threats, coordinate resource distribution, and even make predictive decisions about future conditions. They're essentially biological supercomputers, processing information on scales that dwarf anything achievable by individual organisms. What's most remarkable is that these fungal networks show evidence of learning and adaptation. They modify their information processing strategies based on past experiences, developing increasingly sophisticated responses to environmental challenges. In some cases, they appear to anticipate future problems and begin preparing responses before those problems actually manifest. The implications are staggering. If intelligence can emerge at the level of entire ecosystems, then our understanding of consciousness itself needs fundamental revision. We might be living in a world where true planetary intelligence already exists, but in forms so different from our own experience that we've failed to recognize it. This perspective completely transforms our understanding of why dinosaurs grew so huge. They weren't just large animals that happened to be intelligent. They were components of a planetary intelligence system that required massive scale to function effectively. Their gigantism enabled them to serve as living nodes in a biological network that processed information across continental scales. And this network might still exist today, but in distributed form rather than concentrated in individual giants. The fungal networks beneath forests, the communication systems of marine mammals, the migration patterns of birds, the root systems of trees. All of these might be components of a planetary intelligence system that has been quietly operating around us for millions of years. We've been so focused on individual consciousness, on the intelligence that exists within individual brains, that we've missed the possibility of collective consciousness, intelligence that emerges from the interactions between multiple organisms and systems. This realization has profound implications for how we understand our own role in planetary systems. We've assumed that human intelligence is separate from and superior to natural intelligence. But what if we're actually components of a much larger intelligence system? One that includes not just human consciousness, but also the information processing capabilities of forests, oceans, and the entire biosphere. Our technological networks, our global communication systems, our environmental monitoring capabilities might not be replacements for natural intelligence, but rather extensions of it. We might be evolution's way of augmenting and enhancing the planetary intelligence system that has been developing for billions of years. This perspective suggests that the future of gigantism isn't about creating individual giants, whether biological or technological. It's about recognizing and enhancing the collective intelligence that already exists at planetary scales. It's about learning to participate consciously in systems of awareness and decision-making that operate on scales far beyond individual human comprehension. The dinosaur giants weren't just large animals. They were pioneers. The first successful experiment in creating beings capable of conscious participation in planetary scale intelligence. Their extinction was tragic not just because magnificent creatures were lost, but because it interrupted the development of a form of consciousness that our world desperately needs. But that development has resumed, in new forms and through new pathways, and we have the opportunity to participate consciously in its continuation, to become part of something far larger and more magnificent than individual human intelligence could ever achieve alone. The giants are indeed returning, but not as individual creatures. They're returning as collective consciousness, as planetary intelligence, as the recognition that true wisdom operates at scales that encompass not just our own species, but all of life itself. And in that recognition lies perhaps the most important lesson from the story of why dinosaurs grew so huge. Sometimes, to understand something truly important, you have to become large enough to see it clearly. The dinosaurs grew huge because their world needed giants capable of planetary scale awareness. Our world needs the same thing, but this time we can choose to become those giants together. The consciousness that emerges from these planetary scale networks operates according to principles that challenge everything we thought we understood about intelligence itself. When we observe a forest responding to drought by redistributing water through underground fungal highways, or watch whale pods coordinate hunting strategies across ocean basins, using songs that carry for thousands of miles, we're witnessing something that transcends individual awareness. This distributed intelligence doesn't think the way we do. It doesn't have moments of sudden insight or flashes of inspiration. Instead, it processes information through millions of simultaneous interactions, each one contributing to an understanding that emerges gradually, like the slow recognition of a pattern too vast for any single mind to grasp. But here's what makes this relevant to dinosaur gigantism. The largest dinosaurs may have served as bridges between individual consciousness and this planetary awareness. Their massive brains weren't just scaled-up versions of smaller neural systems. They were interfaces, biological structures capable of translating between the immediate, local awareness that governs individual behavior and the vast, slow patterns that govern planetary systems. Consider what this means for our understanding of extinction events. When the asteroid struck 66 million years ago, it didn't just eliminate individual species. It severed connections in a planetary intelligence network that had been developing for over 160 million years. The giants that could perceive and respond to continent-scale environmental changes vanished, leaving behind a world of fragments, isolated populations struggling to survive without the larger context that had previously guided their behavior. The recovery wasn't just about new species evolving to fill empty ecological niches. It was about rebuilding the information networks that allow life to function as a coherent planetary system. And that rebuilding is still ongoing, taking new forms as different lineages experiment with different approaches to large-scale awareness. Modern technology represents one such experiment. Our satellite networks can monitor global weather patterns in real time. Our communication systems can coordinate responses to environmental challenges within hours. Our transportation networks can redistribute resources across continents within days. In many ways, we've recreated the sensing and response capabilities that the dinosaur giants once provided, but through artificial rather than biological means. Yet there's a crucial difference between technological and biological approaches to planetary scale intelligence. Technology operates through centralized control systems, hierarchical networks that concentrate decision-making power in specific nodes. Biological intelligence, as we see in fungal networks and whale communication systems, operates through distributed consensus, with understanding emerging from the interactions of countless individual components. This difference has profound implications for resilience and sustainability. Centralized systems can achieve rapid, coordinated responses to challenges, but they're vulnerable to cascading failures when key nodes are disrupted. Distributed systems respond more slowly and less dramatically, but they're inherently more stable and self-repairing. The dinosaur giants represent something unique in evolutionary history. Individual organisms large enough to bridge between these two approaches. They combine the rapid response capabilities of centralized intelligence with the resilience of distributed networks. A single sauropod could perceive environmental changes across vast territories and communicate that information to other giants through infrasonic calls, creating a hybrid system that was both responsive and robust. But maintaining such hybrid systems requires precise environmental conditions. The giants needed stable climates, abundant resources, and continuous habitats to function effectively. When those conditions disappeared, the hybrid intelligence network they had created collapsed, leaving behind only the slower, more fragmented distributed systems that characterize our modern world. This collapse wasn't necessarily permanent, though. Evolution is endlessly creative, and it's constantly experimenting with new approaches to large-scale organization and awareness. The question isn't whether planetary-scale intelligence will emerge again, but what forms it might take and whether those forms will be sustainable in our rapidly changing world. Some possibilities are already becoming visible. Urban ecosystems are developing their own forms of hybrid intelligence, combining human planning with the self-organizing properties of natural systems. Smart city technologies are creating feedback loops between human behavior and environmental conditions, allowing urban systems to adapt and respond to changing circumstances in ways that neither purely technological nor purely biological systems could achieve alone. Marine protected areas are showing how ecosystems can rebuild their information networks when given the opportunity. In regions where fishing pressure has been reduced and habitat connectivity has been restored, we're seeing the emergence of communication patterns and coordination behaviors that haven't been observed for decades or centuries. Even more intriguingly, some researchers are beginning to explore the possibility of deliberately enhancing natural intelligence networks through technological augmentation. Imagine fungal networks equipped with sensors that could extend their awareness beyond their immediate chemical environment. Picture whale communication systems enhanced with acoustic amplifiers that could extend their range across entire ocean basins. Such hybrid biological-technological systems might represent the next stage in the evolution of planetary intelligence, combining the best features of both approaches while avoiding their respective limitations. They could achieve the rapid response capabilities that our changing world demands, while maintaining the resilience and sustainability that only biological systems have proven capable of over geological timescales. But perhaps the most remarkable possibility is that consciousness itself might be evolving toward new forms of planetary awareness. Human beings are already participating in collective intelligence networks through social media, scientific collaboration, and global governance systems. We're developing the capacity to think and act at scales that no individual human could achieve alone. What if this collective human intelligence is just the beginning? What if we're evolving toward forms of consciousness that can directly interface with the intelligence networks of forests, oceans, and the entire biosphere? The technology already exists to monitor our brain activity in real time and translate our thoughts into digital signals. It's not inconceivable that future technologies could allow us to directly communicate with the chemical signaling systems of plants or the acoustic networks of marine mammals. Such direct interfaces between human consciousness and natural intelligence networks could create hybrid forms of awareness that transcend anything evolution has achieved through purely biological means. We could literally think with forests, feel with oceans, and perceive with the senses of creatures whose awareness operates on scales far beyond our normal experience. This vision might sound like science fiction, but it's grounded in trends that are already visible in our rapidly advancing understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and information processing in both biological and technological systems. The boundaries between different forms of intelligence are becoming increasingly blurred, and the possibilities for hybrid systems are expanding exponentially. The dinosaur giants showed us that evolution can create forms of intelligence capable of operating at planetary scales. But they also showed us that such intelligence must be sustainable, must enhance rather than degrade the systems it operates within, and must be capable of adapting to changing conditions. As we stand on the threshold of potentially becoming planetary giants ourselves, we have the opportunity to learn from their example and create forms of collective intelligence that are not only powerful, but wise. The question isn't whether we'll develop planetary scale awareness, but whether we'll develop it in ways that serve the long-term flourishing of all life. The giants of the future might not be individual creatures at all. They might be networks of consciousness that span species boundaries, combining human creativity with natural wisdom, technological power with biological resilience, individual awareness with collective intelligence. And in that synthesis, we might finally achieve what the dinosaur giants were reaching toward. Forms of consciousness capable of stewarding entire planets, not through dominance or control, but through understanding, cooperation, and the recognition that true intelligence emerges not from isolation, but from connection, not from competition, but from collaboration, not from the triumph of one form of life over others, but from the celebration of life in all its magnificent diversity. The story of why dinosaurs grew so huge ultimately teaches us that size itself isn't the goal. The goal is connection, understanding, and the capacity to participate consciously in the vast, interconnected systems that sustain life itself. And that capacity, once achieved, might prove to be the most important evolutionary development in the history of our planet, transforming not just how we understand intelligence, but how intelligence understands itself. As we reach the end of our journey through deep time, standing once again in those echoing museum halls where this story began, something profound has shifted in how we see those towering skeletons. They're no longer just impressive relics from a vanished world. They're blueprints for understanding the deepest principles that govern life itself. The dinosaurs grew so huge because their world needed giants, not just for the mechanical advantages of size, but for capabilities that only massive scale could provide. They became living instruments of planetary awareness, biological networks that could sense and respond to environmental patterns across entire continents. Their gigantism wasn't about dominance. It was about connection, coordination, and the emergence of intelligence that operated on scales we're only beginning to understand. But perhaps the most remarkable revelation is that this story isn't over. The same forces that created those ancient titans are still at work today, just expressing themselves in new forms. In the fungal networks beneath our feet, in the global communication systems we've built, in the collective intelligence that emerges when we work together to understand our changing planet. We are living through evolution's second great experiment in planetary scale consciousness. The dinosaurs were the first draft, magnificent but vulnerable to sudden change. We might be the second, not as individual giants, but as a collective intelligence capable of conscious stewardship of the systems that sustain all life. The next time you find yourself dwarfed by a dinosaur skeleton, remember this. You're not looking at the past. You're looking at a preview of what's possible when life learns to think at planetary scales. The age of individual giants may have ended, but the age of conscious, connected, collaborative giants is just beginning. And this time, if we choose wisely, they might be wise enough to ensure that the story continues unfolding for millions of years to come.